Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Francis Hernandez Chalani, and I'm adjunct faculty at the Katy campus. So for me, it's an honor to be here, and want to take this opportunity to thank the Reading Culture Committee in having such a great way to spotlight Venezuela, especially in this time. So let's introduce Professor Julian Cardenas. I'm so happy to introduce him. As a fellow Venezuelan, yes, as a fellow Venezuelan, it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor Julian Cardenas. Professor Cardenas joined the University of Houston Law Center in 2012 as an energy scholar and a visiting professor affiliated to the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center, also known as a EENR, focusing on transnational petroleum law and arbitration. He frequently works with companies, public authorities, and governments in various areas of oil and gas law and policy. At the EENR Center, he is the coordinator of the Inter-American Hydrocarbons Regulator Dialogue, an initiative conceived to create a nexus between national hydrocarbons agencies and the private sector and academia. Since June 2019, Professor Cardenas is on the ad hoc administrative board of directors of Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, the Venezuelan National Oil Company. He has been a guest speaker in conferences relating to this issue all over the world. Professor Cardenas also served for nearly 6 years as a career diplomat for the Venezuelan Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working on multilateral affairs with the Organization of the American States and the United Nations. He holds a law degree and BA in International Relations from the Universidad Central de Venezuela, I must say the best university in Venezuela. A Master of Laws in Arbitration and Diplome Superior at the University in Business Law from the Sorbonne University, and an LLM with a certificate in Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources from the University of Houston Law Center. He was a doctoral fellow at the Research Center for Investment and International Trade Law at the University of Bourgogne, Dijon, France. Professor Cardenas is also a violinist who has played in different symphonic orchestras in Venezuela, France, and the US. He has performed at the Berlin Philharmonic, the Carnegie Hall, and the Sorbonne Amphitheater, among other venues. What else I can say? Bienvenido, Professor Cardenas.
We'll start with the end, because that was the one you said, oh. That was the only section that had some response. Well, sometimes I think the universities draft those bios to be written by other people, but not to be listened by the person. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here to join the Hispanic Month celebration and getting more information, sharing more stories and culture about this diversity, a diverse continent in where we are, diverse world where we live. And the topic that I was asked to discuss today is Venezuela. And we titled this presentation, Why Venezuela Matters. Why what is happening in that country, in the north of South America, matters not only to the United States, the people in the United States, but also for everybody worldwide. The situation that the turmoil that is going through that country impact or is part of a fight or a consequence of a fight for principles that we may all share. Part of those principles are freedom, the respect of a democratic system, which had been the more extended and accepted system, at least in the Americas, not in the world, but at least in the Americas. You can see that most of the countries of the America have democracy, and Venezuela was back then one of the pioneers in have a solid democracy, a democracy that existed at the time where other countries such as Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, or Brazil were going through authoritarian regimes and dictatorships. And that was back in the early 60s. A moment where the world was divided in the Soviet bloc and the capitalist bloc. Was the time of the Cold War, where the United States led a group of countries in Europe to promoting democracy and free market. At the same time, you have the other bloc that was expanding socialist regime and communism and the state, that practice of the state controlling the economy. So what ended happening in Venezuela in the last 20 years was that one of these type of regime took control of the country through elections. The people who led that political trend started actually through violence, trying to coup d'etat in the early 1990s. They failed. Some of them went to jail, but in the democracy that Venezuela had, with all its problems, even at that time, the president at that time decided to release these people at some point and provide them their rights to, if they want to promote change, that do that change through elections. That that decision then brought a democratic change in Venezuela, a change when a new leader emerged, who his name was Hugo Chavez. But then the policy implemented by this person and this leader and his political party was to extend his control of all the institutions. So here is the first point that I want to stop for a second. When one power, in this case the executive branch, start concentrating on other powers such as parliament or the judicial branch, then you don't have what you are seeing in television here in the United States every day. Check and balance. That role of the different powers of the state that have to limit the power of the other branches of the state, of the government, I must say. That is essential for democracy. But democracy is not only going to vote every 4 years, every 6 years, or 8 years. There are other components of democracy that then has an impact in the operativity of the system and how that system then translates in your day-to-day lives. So, as you can see, for example, in the United States, there are many decisions that even the executive branch, the President of the United States, who could be, considered one of the more powerful persons in the world, cannot decide everything by decree. He had been challenged in courts, he had been challenged in Congress, and then you see how democracy tried to maintain balance and not concentrate power only in one person. There's one friend, economist, Juan Ramón Rayo, Spanish economist, who said, had a sentence that said, "Do you remember when Donald Trump was only a billionaire?" We tend to think that having money is having power, and the money gives you all power, or can drive you to all kind of power. However, political power has also the option to influence over other people, and then to take the fate or the destiny of a whole nation. Okay? Imagine that in this country you don't have that balance, and only one person can take control of Congress, of governors, or the judicial system. It will turn a different regime that you are used to, that you grew up in this country, or that may explain why even today, I would say, the United States, one of the countries that people trying to move and do immigration in the United States looking for opportunities. I am going to say even still today, because today conditions are the same that used to be in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, where the economy probably and the conditions to be an immigrant in the United States were different than they are today. So imagine that, let's say, privilege that in some sort of way you can have in this nation, and then imagine that all these privileges at some point are turned down. That happened in Venezuela progressively. After a number of years, what happened is that this leader started to diminishing all these balances, all the possibilities or chances that other people, other political groups could block, could interfere in all his policies and wills. Not only that, he had the support, international support on his doings. He was not alone. He got the support of other nations that wanted to work with him and were interested, actually, that he remains in power and that he controls everything in politics. Why? Because one of the things that Venezuela is very rich is in natural resources, particularly in oil. And the exploitation of natural resources and oil lasts for decades. These are not countries that, these are not operations that can be done in just 3 years and you take your profits and you run out. These are operations, mining and oil take decades to do the investment and then recover and have an economic profit for investors. Well, in this case, do you think many companies were willing that when they are doing businesses, the government change and new people can come around and then change the conditions that they have in their contracts? So there was another, for some companies or some investors, that interest that that person remain in power. That's the case of Chinese corporation, that's the case of Russian corporation, that's the case of even American corporation, or the case of Cuba, that at the time was a country that lost the support of the Soviet Union, that because the Soviet Union was collapsed and then Russia was not able to provide economic funding to that regime of Fidel Castro, and then suddenly you have Hugo Chavez taking alliance with Fidel Castro and exchanging financial aid by intelligence support that will keep Hugo Chavez in power for more than 50 years. So you have in that case an exchange of one of the best resources that Cubans have, or the Cuban regime, which is keep one person in power for decades. And they proved that in the case of Fidel Castro. So all that brought as a consequence that Venezuela was more and more every year after year concentrated power in the person of Hugo Chavez. And after going through third election, very questionable in 2012, then he was sick at the time, and he died. He died, and then a new election and a new leader of his party, appointed by him before dying, ran the following election in 2013 and took control of the power. Went to the election. The election was very controversial. However, he reached power and started the 6 years that we can count from 2013 till now, that where you will see what is happening in the collapse of Venezuela. This is why the collapse of Venezuela is not a process that only happened in the last 3 years, not in the last 2 years. It's something that it covers at least 2 decades. But the more dramatic collapse has been in the last 6 years during the regime of Nicolas Maduro. So we see in this spectrum of time how poverty, at some point, that oil prices went very high for the government of Hugo Chavez. He was a populist. He was somebody that People may consider that was doing social aid to people, but social aid translated also in social control. He kept people out of private entrepreneurship, reducing the space for private companies, reducing the opportunities for private investor, actually doing something that is called expropriation, which is a taking over of property. And the state start having control of everything. Imagine that at some point, the president of the United States decided that H-E-B, Kroger, and all another chain of supermarket will turn to be part of the U.S. government. Imagine that all that happened nationally. Supermarket, farms, not only oil and gas. But imagine that expansion start increasing the size of the state and reducing the participation of the private companies. Can the state fund having more than half of the population as public employees or national government employees? That will be very hard because you need private companies, private investors that make profit, that from that profit you take taxes, and with that you fund the state. If you have the state and all is state-owned, then the losses of those businesses and companies, the state-owned, also goes against your taxes or your money. You have less money for education, less money for health, less money for the functioning of the state. So yes, even though Marx, the management of the economy at some point was celebrated by international organizations, just like the International Organization of the United Nations for Food or for Health, then it was all fake. It was all part of control of the state over the population. When suddenly the economic conditions changed, just suddenly all the index were back to the same situation that existed, or even worse, the situation that existed before Chavez arrived to power. This is these three pictures I'm using to illustrate. It's a square. It's called in Caracas the Plaza Venezuela or Venezuelan Square. This is in 1978 when still Caracas was a small city, big town. Let's put it that way, in the middle of, but was a thriving city in terms of the country lived already the oil boom of the 70s. So it was a rich nation at the time compared even with the other countries in South America. 1998, the year Chavez won the election, again, a country with a lot of problems, democracy that was not perfect, but still a society that was inserted in international market, private investment, international commerce. Now this is Plaza Venezuela or Venezuelan squares today. It kind of looks devastated. And this is just an example that they is replicated in the whole country. Imagine that happened to hospitals, to schools, to universities today. And more dramatically is to the salaries of people there. Imagine that today people used to mention that Cuba was a poor country because Cubans have a salary, professional people with a university degree of $22 a month. They have public education, they say. They have free healthcare, and they tend to say that they have free education. What happens is that after they graduate, they can only earn $22 a month. So, in my opinion, that's the moment when you start paying, actually. It's the most expensive education, because that's the standard that you will get. Today, a university professor in Venezuela will have a salary with the highest rank of $6 a month. People retire taking their pensions, they earn $2 a month. So it's very dramatic, the situation of hunger and poverty that you can see. I mean, this is like even 2015, but this go even more than that today. Okay, it has trespassed, and this is why you have the immigration crisis of Venezuela. The amount of Venezuelans that have leave the country has increased in the last 3 years because of the collapse of the economy. And many of these Venezuelans have go through South America, especially Colombia. Venezuela is a country of 30 million people. You may consider Venezuela like the population of Texas, 27 million people. So you may have an idea. That's the size of the population. The difference that the economy of Texas is around 35 times bigger than the economy today of Venezuela. Just to give you an impression. So why Venezuela matters? Well, not solving that problem, trying to hide and trying to ignore the problem may work, or probably work for a few years, but then in this globalized economy that we have, in this possibility that some people have to leave their country to escape actually from this humanitarian crisis, they go and they start going to different countries. And at the beginning you may consider, okay, these are few Venezuelans. Oh, we start noticing the Venezuelan accent in some countries in South America. Oh, some of them come with university degrees. They have public education in Venezuela. And it was good, so they could be inserted in the economy and of our country. So at some point, it seems like something that not to be concerned. But when that amount translates from, moved from 200,000, 300,000 to now 4 million people, then you start having problems because Colombia has now more than 1.5 actually Venezuelans in their territory. They have a population of 44 million people, but that start impacting their economy because Venezuelans get to borders towns in Colombia that requires healthcare, that requires health systems to the people that are moving from Venezuela. Peru, Ecuador also having countries that have opened their borders to Venezuela, but again are now collapsing. They cannot handle as much Venezuela that can go to these countries. And actually to the United States, that number has also increased. Political asylum had multiplied by 5 here in the United States of Venezuela that are escaping from this political crisis. And again, it's people that are running out because we collapse, we fail as a society to protect basic principles: freedom, democracy, and I must say, free market. I must say, even free market. Now, it can be controversial to talk about political system in terms of the United States make a lot of trade with China, not being China a democracy, but providing private ownership for some companies being inserted in global markets and international trade. But democracy, freedom, and free market was part of the construction of the Americas. It's different than the system that we cannot compare with Asia in those terms. But that's the model that now Venezuela is trying to copy, not only Cuba, but the recent visit of one of the leaders of Maduro's parliament. Maduro recently just sent a delegation to North Korea, a country with 27 million people, 30 million people in population, that more or less has very close size of the economy that Venezuela has now. So with the size of the economy that Venezuela has now, still a strong government is capable to kidnap 27 million people. Not only is poverty the problem, not only immigration is part of the problem. The government of Venezuela has also been involved in cases of drug trafficking. Venezuela has turned to be the country where drugs go through and goes out to Europe or the United States, or then Central America to then move to the United States. When having all control in only one branch of the government, that branch of the government also controls the military, and then if the military is corrupted, Then you have also the intervention of international organized crime. These are two nephews of the President Maduro's wife that were captured in Haiti, doing a dealing with trafficking of cocaine. And actually, well, I use their case because their case have already been sentenced in the Second Circuit in New York, and they have been condemned. They were found guilty of drug trafficking. So imagine that at that high level of government, they control the equipment, the airplanes, the security and information access of the government. Imagine at that high level what you can find when you go a little bit down. It's all spread, and all these lines that you see here are submarines or are air channels where planes or small planes, Cessna planes, they can go and do the distribution of drugs. So you have also part of the economy of Venezuela now that have oil production have reduced, revenues from oil have collapsed, but drug still provides black market access to funds for the government to run. Not only is drugs in that place in the world is connected with terrorism because it's linked with the Colombian guerrillas. Colombian guerrillas were groups, military groups that tried to fight to change government in Colombia, and guerrilla groups have been in Colombia for more than 60 years. Some of them reached a peace agreement 3 years ago, but still there are some groups active. These groups at some point were fighting to change the government for political purposes, following philosophical political ideas, and to change government in Colombia. But then, in order to fund their war, at some point they could receive support of some governments. But then they realized, if we control towns in Colombia, and these areas are producers of cocaine or weed, we can also control security, provide security, and help to the traffic of drugs. So guerrilla groups have that who work in the border with Colombia and Venezuela. Then they can move to Venezuela, and with the support of the Maduro's government, they can escape from the security forces of Colombia. So they use the area, the border of Venezuela, just to keep safe out of the security forces and the army of Colombia, in one way. But having this practice for a number of years, then they start controlling areas in Venezuela. Not only controlling areas, they control also mines, gold mines, mineral mines in Venezuela. And then we have that Colombian, that what used to be a Colombian problem, now has turned to be a security problem in Venezuela. So one of the challenges that may have a future government, if at some point there is a change in Venezuela, is to solve the issue how to deal with these groups. Because these groups were before acting on the other side of the border, but then they have found a refuge, they found a place to operate and to be safe. So not only drugs, poverty, drugs, terrorism. Then oil. Venezuela is considered the country with the biggest oil reserves in the world. They provide, or they used to provide, an important quota among the oil producers nation, producing more than 3 million barrels of oil a day. That is even less today than what Texas is producing today. Texas by its own is producing more than 4 million barrels of oil a day. It's incredible how Texas has increased production, but at the same time, in the same decade, since 2008, that Texas started increasing oil production, Venezuela lived that collapse. That is the one that we have today. It was a nation that used to produce those more than 3 million, even when Hugo Chavez arrived. But reaching this point is not a consequence of Chavez's government. It's actually a consequence of a private ownership policy that existed in the 1990s that, again, because oil is a long-term business, you don't see the results just right away. You have to wait. So contracts that were signed in the 90s, then they came to the results at the beginning of the government of Hugo Chavez. This collapse that you see here was the strike, the massive strike of oil workers that used to work in the Venezuelan National Company. They decided to do a massive strike against the government of Hugo Chavez. And as a response, Hugo Chavez fired 20,000 of those employees, many of them that you will see in Katy or in Sugarland or working here for oil companies, because that produced a brain drain from the country. And again, you may talk that the wealth and what makes rich a country is their oil or their access to natural resources, the geographical location, but the purpose of the talk is to show you that also principal values are the ones that, if you don't protect that, is that can make collapse your country. Japan doesn't need oil to be one of the biggest economy in the world. And with all the resources, Venezuela has not even is now very close to have the size of the economy of North Korea, which represent a reduction of more than 600% in the last 6 years. Actually, today the formal side of the Venezuelan economy is the same size of the Cuban economy. And Cuba have 14, 15 million people in population. Venezuela have double that number. So you can imagine how poor the country has turned. So you have this collapse. Then Hugo Chavez promised many plans to take this number to 5 to 6. Nothing of that was achieved. None of them. None of the several projects he announced and invited companies to join the oil industry reach a success. And then at the moment the economic crisis increases, the immigration crisis also increases, the geopolitical problems started, and then not only Nicolas Maduro has his supporters, particularly Russia, China, and Iran, then you have at this point intervention of the United States and a number of countries. And these take us to the period of sanctions. Venezuela today is a country under sanctions. U.S. companies are not free to do businesses with the Venezuelan National Company. Some of them have special permits that allow them to go there and continue doing business, but not new business can be created. But this collapse is not the consequence of those sanctions. Those sanctions are impacted. This is a collapse of all workers leaving the country because they cannot live with $15 a month. They cannot feed their families with $15 a month. They prefer to go to Peru to work in cyber cafes, to work as a technician. In other countries that can make $100, $300, $500 in the economies of these countries. But imagine how can you notice the change in your life if you were earning $15 a month and then suddenly you reach $500? For a Venezuelan, that is huge. And for a Venezuelan, even with a degree on engineering. So you have this collapse. The figure right now, the official, says that from 3.4, now the number is 600,000 barrels of oil. But probably that number will be cut in half just in the upcoming 2 months. So that collapse continues. Very difficult to do imports in the country, very difficult to attract talent. So with all that dramatic scenario, we landed in 2019. 2019, that was the moment when a sham election that was held in 2018, where Nicolas Maduro controlled all different branches of government, but also the electoral council in the country, then that election was not recognized by the international community, including the United States, the European Union, and countries in the Americas. So what happened when the end of the period of the tenure of Nicolás Maduro that started in 2013, after Hugo Chavez died, then the international community did not recognize that new tenure of Nicolás Maduro, and then the head of the parliament, the congressman that was at the time the head of the parliament, which was Juan Guaidó, was recognized according to the constitution as the new interim president of the nation. And that is the situation you are seeing now in the news. Okay? So now the country is divided, politically divided, in terms of that Maduro still controls the army, still controls the non-formal armed groups such as guerrilla or the paramilitary groups that exist in the country. Also controls positions in government. It still controls the oil industry internally. And so with that, you may consider that it still keeps a lot of power that keep him controlling many sections of the country. Juan Guaidó, on his side, he is the president of the parliament. He lead a parliament where that the majority of the parliament is used to be opposition, now it's government, because it's supporting the interim government. But then when you have that kind of internal situations, then that took a different path in this case compared with other crises that happened before in Europe or in the Americas, is that the international community decided to intervene. And the way they decided to intervene is to give recognition to Juan Guaidó. Juan Guaidó was recognized by the majority of countries in the Americas, all of them democracies, the majority of democracies of Europe, the European Union. So a number of at least 60 nations has recognized Juan Guaidó as a president. That have provided Guaidó to appoint diplomats in organizations such as the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C. Not the same success in the United Nations. The United Nations still recognize Nicolás Maduro government as a elected government in Venezuela. And this is how the international community is divided. While this situation persists, poverty will continue to increase. Geopolitical uncertainty in the region will also continue over time. The collapse of the oil industry also have not reached its bottom. It can continue collapsing, having an impact on the economy of the country. And when you wrap up all these elements, you may guess that also the migration crisis may continue. So why the case matters? It matters to the international community is if the international community or the international community may continue to highlight awareness, the concern about this case. There's no reason why the case with such a number of natural resources and the possibilities to develop a rich economy have been taking their population just to go to this collapse. The consequence of the situation in Venezuela is even worse than you have a case of war or natural disaster. Normally you have a natural disaster and the international community intervene and you have to find solutions, and then investment will start flowing to that country and jobs will start arriving to the country, and the economy may have a return. In this case, the situation continues. That collapse continues, and even the collapse or the number of refugees that are out, the Venezuelan out in the Americas, is almost the same as the Syrian refugees crisis, which is another example for different factors. Again, we may try to close our eyes and try to believe that in Syria nothing was happening, and the international community decided not to intervene. But then what did the Syrians? They went to Europe. They went to Canada. They tried to come to the United States. In today's globalized world, where you have immigration that have existed in different times of history, then the communities that are going through this type of turmoils, then they may find a place elsewhere just to go and to live. But that doesn't solve the problem. That solves the problem for the individuals who are trying to escape temporarily. Because as any Venezuelan who is living here in Houston, if they forgot their nation. No, they are here. Their mind and heart are there. And they would love to return one day and try to contribute to the reconstruction of that country. Try to make it a better place again. But still today, we are in that stage. 2019, we don't know what may happen, may continue all this crisis. We don't know if the solution may come in 2020, a new election may happen, but what is important for everybody today is just to realize how important freedom, democracy, respect of the law are the pillars of societies like this society. It's just that fragile. If we don't respect these values, it's just that fragile that a situation may go that way. There's no reason other than to be to have ignored all the alarms, all the wake-up calls of people saying, if we let this group of people concentrate in all this power, we will collapse. And people used to say no. Venezuelans used to say, we're not Cubans. And now, what I was saying, before Maduro sent their people to know how Cuban government handled the population. Now they are sending people to North Korea because the side of the economy is going that way. It's going that way. So it's not a problem of just mismanagement of the oil industry. It's not even a problem. All other oil industry, the reduction of price of oil also affected Iran, also affected Saudi Arabia, also affected other countries, Nigeria, but Venezuela is the only country collapsing. So it's not the price of oil, it's not only mismanagement of the economy in a way that, it's a socialist nation or that kind of way. Is when society fails, and when I say society, I'm included in that society. We as a society, we fail. And we fail in protecting and promoting respect of those basic principles of freedom, democracy, and free market private ownership. And a state cannot control everything. You cannot control only to one person. And you have that collapse. So I didn't want this talk to be as depressing as it may sound. But the lesson or the message is remember how important it is to protect those values. And when you go out and you see, and you see in the news that despite the exercise of power that you may see that a president or a government may have, please see also how a tribunal, how a congressman or congresswoman can also be part of that check and balance, because that's the only way that democracy or your system of freedom and liberties can continue. So thank you. I'm open for questions. Yes?
So what are the upward trends that are in Venezuela right now currently?
The what?
The upward trends. I know you showed a graph that just went flowing down, but I mean, with every depression, there's a rise in something.
There's a rise?
No, he's asking if it can go up, and you say that it's all down. It's already
no. Well, this is a lesson of that, probably that thought that we may all have that at some point you see a crisis and you say, oh, it can be worse than that. No, yeah, it can. It can. There's no bottom in this type of crisis. The bottom could be, you may think that at some point the bottom was Venezuela will have 3 million immigrants. Now we are more than 4. And the United Nations also is already preparing programs and talking with countries in South America because the number can reach 8 million. So how's the conditions there? I'm in contact there. I have family there. I'm in contact every day with what is going on there. And yes, when you have this type of crisis, you may have bubbles. So people that in some sort of way may try to find a normal life. But a normal life that you accept your restrictions. The other day I was on TV on Monday, I think, on CNN. I was asked to participate in a TV program in CNN in Spanish, and the interview was about power outrages in California. So 1 day, 2 days of power outrages in California, or a few hours, and that was a crisis. California by its own, but California as a state is the 5th largest economy in the world. And it was having those type of problems today. By the way, free market in the control of the electricity. Probably too many quote of the market in one company, but that was the issue. Imagine that you live in a country that you will have 8 hours of without electricity every day, or that there is a power shutdown that will last for 4 or 5 days. Why? So if you are there and you have no options, you have to deal with it. You have to be like Cubans or the people in North Korea. By the way, 2 countries where nobody is applying for visas to go there and to move there and to go and find a job or even to do a degree in a university. So you can see cases that people may trying to find a normal life with all these conditions. I have a cousin that have power, that have with the power problem, they have portable, power generators. They kind of stuff that the thing that you can go to Costco and you can buy that stuff. So they buy actually the thing in Costco and they send that to Venezuela, and so they have that. But that is the people that have access in some sort of way to U.S. dollars. But you have the rest of the population. The rest, that number of poverty is the people that have no access to that.
Can I ask a question about? Sure. So you said that college professors make around $6 a month.
The highest rank.
The highest. What does that equate to? Like what? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like $6 barely buys a hamburger. Like how?
They show that on Twitter. I can tell you. They say with that salary, because a college professor was showing that on Twitter 5 days ago. Because 5 days ago was an increase in the salary for 300%, but inflation is 200,000%. So they show you that we can have like a pound of cheese and then 6 eggs, and then it's not enough to feed even one person, and not even one person for a week. And to get that salary, you must have a PhD. With that salary, you may have a PhD, and you may have 25 years or 20 years working research in a university with publications. So what happened with those people? They go to other countries. So who is teaching classes in Venezuela? What will be the preparation of the next generation of Venezuela who have to solve this problem? So you have Venezuelans abroad, you have now Venezuelans inside going through all these challenges. So if this situation continues, then the recovery will be even tougher for people. There are economies that started to doing assessment of this crisis and say, well, we may need $50 billion to try to restore the economy of Venezuela, to take it to a new normal. 6 months later, the same economies in another article says, no, well, our calculation, our assessment now, it requires 80 billion. So we had that economist here at Rice University one day, and I say, so what will say the next article? Do you think the international community is just, free to increase as Venezuelans? They failed to find a solution. So what may happen, resources are limited. We cannot get into that fake that resources are unlimited. No, the resources are actually limited, and other countries also are fighting for resources. So if we, while this crisis continues, then also the recovery will be tougher. In my case, I have never seen Venezuela as a country that people go. I mean, me as my generation, I studied in France, and I saw here in the United States, and I saw my colleagues from Brazil that after graduation they could go back to Brazil, and they were hired by law firms and companies because they knew people there, and they could help to bring investments and all that. Also with Colombians and Mexicans, that happened. And when I saw that even with good empathy, if that exists, but because I didn't have the choice and the opportunity to do that in my country, because it was all state control. What I will say, you can go there and try to buy a farm and produce cultural goods, products in Venezuela. You have a risk to be expropriated. Not only that, when I mentioned here only the economic side, but the political side is also very tough. Being an opposition politician in Venezuela, you will risk to be killed or put into jail. The new generation, the number is close to 500 political prisoners in Venezuela today. And it's also why the international community has been very sensitive to that and is doing pressure to try to fight for the freedom of these politicians that are into jail. Me, myself, I cannot return to the country. Now that I was appointed to be part of the new PDVSA board, me and all my colleagues, and me, we cannot enter the country right now. So yeah, you listen to somebody disclosure, but yeah, I'm involved in the situation. Any other question, comment, or fears? Yes.
Yes, well, I'm from Cuba, so I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
I wanted to know what are the countries in Europe that do not support Guaido? Because you said that the majority do. What are the ones that don't? The ones in Europe that do not.
Yeah, what happened in Europe is all of the European Union as a group, they supported Guaido. Okay. What happened is that the way they did the recognition was sui generis. It's like they recognize Guaido, but the diplomats they have from Guaido, they are recognized as personal boss of the president. So not an ambassador. And Maduro's ambassadors are still there. So for example, Spain now recognizes Guaido as the interim president, does not recognize Maduro, but has an ambassador from Maduro in Madrid. Okay, so the situation is so complex that do not expect a lot of coherence at all levels. It's very politically, it's very complicated because also the interests of international companies from these countries are involved here in Venezuela. So from some companies, they ask their government not to get too much involved, to provide support, but not to get too much involved. Also, the issue was that when all this crisis started, for many, probably a bad assessment, they considered that all this international support will help for the collapse of Nicolas Maduro in 3 months. And they failed. And we will be reaching a year in 3 months. And we don't know what we can expect in 2020. So more likely that this situation of two people in power won't last forever. The question mark is that those giving advice to Maduro know very well how to keep somebody like him for 60 years in power. So the Cuban method and the North Korean method have been proved, have been tested already. So intelligence, control of power, and the control of the security forces, again, formal and paramilitary groups, can help Maduro to continue in power. But we don't know yet. What we may expect is more Venezuelan immigrants. The situation will continue to be collapsing. The turmoil will persist. But the end of this soap opera is still to be seen. Any other questions? Yes, sure.
Is it because Iran is in the country, and Cubans are in the country?
Yeah.
That is complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated. I won't say that. Yeah, I won't say that.
Because if they were only Venezuelans, they could fight it out. But there are other.
What you're saying is very right. I will say more Cubans than people from Iran, although Iran is an ally of Nicolas Maduro. But what you can extract from that is this is already an international crisis. This is not that it started to be an international crisis when Guaido's arrived and you have this divided world in terms of who support who in Venezuela. The international intervention started with Cuba after the oil strike, when more Cuban doctors were sent to the country, more intelligence people from the Cuban armed forces got inserted in the Venezuelan government and in the army. So the United States have calculated that at least 25,000 Cubans are working in some institution in the government, civil government or military. Also Russia have sent military support. Most of the Nicolas Maduro military arsenal come from Russia. So it's already an international conflict, number one. It's already a military conflict. In the news, people say, oh, military intervention will be crazy, the intervention of use of force in Venezuela, it's a challenge or it's a crazy idea. However, Venezuelans are under a military regime. Venezuelans who try to go to the street, any protester, demonstration have received the response of the government through weapons, using the use of arms. Last year, between 2017 and 18, more than 100 people have been killed in demonstrations in Venezuela. But that is only one portion. Imagine that with the collapse of public health, the people that are just dying because they don't have access to medicine. People that are dying because they are starving. They have no access to food or to food that provide the nutrients just to have a normal life. So it's already a military international conflict. It's already a military conflict, and it's already a humanitarian crisis. So all those elements is happening there. Yes.
So what do you think the international community should do?
The government of Juan Guaido is working right now to have more recognitions, more international recognition. It will be key at some point to that Guaido get access to the United Nations. But again, democracy has been a system, like democracy, not perfect democracy. Democracy with all its problems, but it has been the system that has been accepted by the Americans. With the exception of Cuba, all countries in America allowed to go to elections and free press and the check and balance system in power. But democracy is not a global principle. That's the issue. And the United Nations is a global institution. In the United Nations, you will have kingdoms, you will have dictatorships, and the international community accept those legal regimes as the legitimate regimes. This is why China is in the Security Council. China is member of the United Nations. So diversity of the government system are accepted in the United Nations. You cannot go to the United Nations and say you have to be a democracy to be a member of the United Nations. That would go against of most of regimes in the world, important number of regimes in the world. However, democracy has been a principle. We have 5. That generation had 5 in America in order to reduce the power of military dictators at some point, or dictatorships in general. So one of the things will be to have more pressure of the international community. Maduro is at some point running out of money. We'll see how much money will be left on his control. He does not control, for example, Citgo here in the United States. He has no access to those resources. So he has access to resources that may come from mining or drug trafficking, but not oil. Oil has been very, very limited because the collapse of the production, and also because he's had more difficulties to sell the oil because of this situation and the U.S. sanctions. So the peaceful way, probably the solution that will be a benefit for everybody involved in this crisis, the international community and the Venezuela, will be a new set of elections. So that Venezuela peacefully, through an agreement, can do general elections of president, parliament, governors. So run general elections again. The problem is that you need new institutions, and because institutions have been kidnapped, there is no trust in that the new elections can be run with the system that Venezuela have today. Other people, in 2018 and 18, you may find more and more articles from academia, from specialized or specialists on military conflicts, that the use of force at some point may be necessary, but the use of force also needs international political will. It's very unlikely that a group of nations can join an initiative of that kind. There's only one nation that can do that. So the problem will be whether that option is feasible. But that is the situation. It doesn't seem very close, that type of solution. However, what we have seen from other type of crisis of this kind in Eastern Europe, when the collapse of the Soviet Union, is that when this system will collapse very fast. Probably you won't see it, but when they collapse, they will go away very fast. Any other question, comment, or fears? Try it. I think we're done. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.